So hi again, I'm Tanya. I'm the Client Success Lead at ADRES. Thank you for joining our last session in the Data Integrity webinar series. For those of you who haven't had the chance yet to hear about ADRES, here are a few words brief. So ADRES is an international consultancy company at the biopharma industry. Our clients are startups and companies across the globe, and we specialize in regulatory affairs, QA, and CMC. And today I'm excited to have here with me Roy Zaibel, our co-CEO, who will be discussing source data verification. And additionally, we have today a special guest, Sivan Reznik, the QA Associate Director at OPKO, and she will present her case study. The webinar will last for 45 minutes, followed by a QA session. During the webinar, feel free to write your questions in the QA section, and Roy will address them in the end of the session. So thank you once again for being here today and in all other sessions we had. Roy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Sivan. Special thank for you for joining us as well. I just want to remind everybody that this is the fourth part of a series of data integrity and computerized system validation series of webinars. And this is the conclusion of the series. And if you missed the earlier parts, feel free to email Tanya and she will send you the links to the previous recordings. And if you watch all four, you can then request to have a certificate for your annual training for data integrity and computerized system validation. And for today, our agenda, as Tanya mentioned already, we are discussing source data verification. So we'll cover the definitions and the context, source data verification implementation, common pitfalls and solutions, and then we'll go to our guest case study by Sivan. And I just want to remind you what we discussed in the previous sessions. On the first one, we discussed what data integrity is and what the requirements are, regulatory-wise, and we discussed a few of the definitions, the main definitions. Then we discussed computerized system validation and what it means for a sponsor or any owner of these systems, what you need to do, the difference between compatible and compliant. And then we discussed risk assessment and company management of data integrity throughout the activities. And today we're discussing a topic that is a bit specific, but actually you can look at it as a conclusion of the topic also because everything comes down to it eventually. The source data verification is a process in which you assure that all of your data is verified against the original data that was generated. And in order to be able to perform this activity, you have to comply with all the principles that we discussed in the previous webinars. If you followed all of these principles, then once you get into the source data verification process, you're supposed to be covered and be capable of doing it. So let's get into a few definitions. We'll start with what is source data versus raw data. These are two terms that you might hear that are being used. And they are not the same, though they are very similar and they have some overlap between them. Source data is the original records or certified copies that are necessary for reconstructing and evaluating findings. So these are the first records that you have before you started processing the data or transferring the data, shifting it to another a database or another report. This is the original, these are the original records. For example, signed case report forms or instrument outputs. And the source data, this is a quote from the Guidance for Industry Part 11 by the FDA. The source data includes all information in original records and certified copies necessary for reconstruction. Whereas raw data is the initial records of measurements or observations, unprocessed and not yet transformed for analysis. So this is sometimes this is the same as the source data in case where the source data is captured in a form that is filled in by an analyst, for example. But sometimes this is different. It's the data that the instrument receives, the reading, before it translates it, excuse me, into the data that you receive as the report. And the validation of the system makes sure that that raw data is shifted into the source data in a valid way. So you actually only have to be concerned about the source data, and that's why for our use, source data and raw data are interchangeable. And why is it important to properly identify the source data? Misidentification leads to regulatory discrepancies, and proper source data identification ensures traceability during audits and submissions. So let's get a bit more into that. Why is source data verification critical? So first, it's for regulatory compliance. If we provide the data, we want to be sure that we provide an accurate data, a reliable data that we can say to the regulators with no doubt that this is the correct data, that it is based on the correct data. So this is one. Second is the data accuracy and quality. The verification process prevents errors from being embedded in later stages. If you don't verify and find out these errors that you have sometimes systematically, then eventually you're going to be left with a lot of data that is incorrect. Your decisions might be wrong because they're not based on the right data. And you might have to repeat some of the tests or processes that you already went through because you can't rely on that data or the data is incorrect. And it identifies and resolves discrepancies early. That's relevant again to the data accuracy and the regulatory compliance. And eventually, the data that you're going to submit to the regulatory bodies, it's a requirement of it to be verified. So it's actually not just the benefit of the verification. You just simply have to verify your data in case you're going to submit it. Let's look a bit at the regulations, what they say about source data verification. So in the ICH GCP 6 R2, source data should be accurate, legible, contemporaneous, original, and attributable. So this is actually the ALCOA that we mentioned already in the first webinar. The FDA guidance on electronic source data in clinical investigations. Source data includes all information in original records and certified copies of original records of clinical findings, observations, or other activities in a clinical trial necessary for the reconstruction and evaluation of the trial. Now, you may notice that this is about clinical investigations, but actually this is correct for manufacturing as well, and every GXP-related activity. The source data and the verification of it need to expose all the steps and all the processes conducted with the data and always lead to the original records. And the EMA guideline on computerized systems and electronic data in clinical trials. Data should be traceable throughout the data life cycle Any changes to the data should be documented as part of the metadata, for example, audit trail. And if we recall the topic of the issue of metadata, the metadata is a crucial part for source data identification and verification. When you want to see the final results or the final processed data, you want to see how it leads to the original data, the source data, you need to have all the metadata that gives you the contexts and allows you to identify what is the source for these specific records. And I want to again mention the fact that these three guidelines are from clinical operations perspectives. And just to make it clear that for manufacturing, again, the same standards are required. However,
Ro'i?
the same principles, and I will get into that soon. So you will find more guidelines referring to source data verification, which are addressed to clinical stages. However, you need to understand that for GMP and GLP, the same standards are required for the activities that are conducted and the data that is generated and processed. We'll get more into that a bit later in my part, and Sivan will refer to that as well later on. If we think about the source data verification, the challenges in conducting it is first the identification. We many times find manufacturers that don't truly identify or correctly identify what the source data is, and they use some already processed reports as the source data, whereas these are not the original records. You can see it many times when Excel sheets are being used. So this is one problem. Another problem is human error, misinterpretation of data during verification. This is why it needs to be controlled by QA, and the definitions need to be very clear how to verify the data, and the people need to be trained. Inconsistent documentation, gaps in metadata, obscure traceability. Sometimes the method for documentation changes, and then there's a change in the way that the data needs to be verified, and it's not documented well, and it causes confusions. And resource constraints, it takes a lot of time to verify all of the data. It can be very labor intensive for small teams, and you need to be as lean as possible for these processes and truly define what data needs to be verified and at what point should it be verified. You can sometimes maintain the data in a state in which it is still not verified, but it is ready for verification once you need it. Let's move on to risk-based source data verification. That's actually relates to what I just mentioned, that you decide when to verify and what data to verify. So what is risk-based source data verification? You prioritize the verification efforts on high-risk data points, where data is being processed, shifted, can be accessed somehow. Again, the use of Excel sheets that is very problematic, or can be very, very problematic. So you need to prioritize the verification for these data points. You need to focus on areas with the greatest impact on patient safety, product quality, or compliance. And to that, I can add that you need to prioritize it according to timelines, business timelines, processes that are expected, you need to be prepared for. So if you are preparing for a submission, for example, you need to plan when to start the source data verification efforts. And all of these risk-based efforts are based on the principles from the previous webinar, the FMEA and the risk prioritization. And it enables efficient allocation of resources. Again, you don't need to perform all of the verification immediately. Some of it can be left to later stages. The tools for effective source data verification are data management systems. These assemble all of the data in one system. It does it systematically in a way that it's very easy to track it back to the original records. So you have it for clinical trials, the CTMS, or for laboratory, the LIMS. Audit trail review tools, they maintain traceability because then you can see the changes that were done to the data and trace them back to the original records. You can sometimes lean on the audit trail as a main tool for the source data verification, and sometimes use it as a backup in case some problems occur while trying to verify the data. And templates and checklists. These are important. Once you verify the data, you need to understand exactly and know exactly what you are verifying. So you have to have some sort of a checklist that outlines what to look for, how to identify each test or report, and how it leads back to the origin. And as I mentioned already before, the source data verification changes across the development phases. For early R&D, the data collection is informal, but must remain traceable. And you can say that this is for two main reasons. One is the regulatory aspect. Some of the early R&D data is going to be used in order to base the later development processes of the product. And for that, it's going to be submitted alongside the later reports that you're going to yield. And for that, you will need to verify that specific set of data, R&D data. It's not all of the data that you generate. It's actually probably a small part of it, but still a very important. So you need to keep it in a state in which you will be able to verify it once you need to. And another reason is, I would say, more a business reason. This data is very important. This is actually what you manufacture as an early stage company. And if you don't use it in a good manner and don't store it in an organized fashion, once you want to re-examine it in any way, you're not going to be able to do it. Once you move to GLP studies, you need formal systems to ensure data attribution and traceability. You need to be able to know for each report who generated it, what method is it related to, etc. And for clinical trials, compliance with ICH GCP, metadata integrity is critical. And for these, you can say that you need to verify more or less everything. The time points for which you decide to verify can vary. Whereas once you go to commercialization, you need to verify the data all the time. It needs to be audit ready at every given moment, and you can't really play with the time points for the source data verification. And this concludes my part of this webinar. And before I let Sivan tell her story, I just want to give some background. I've been working with Sivan and with her team at OPKO Biologics for years back. And at one point, we worked together on the implementation of a new HPLC system. And we went through a very complex configuration process. If you all remember the GAMP categories, that was a hard category 4, a lot of configuration. We worked with the vendor, a very thorough process was conducted. And then the question raised, how is it backed up, all of this data that is generated? And then we had a big meeting with the management and the heads of the teams and QA, of course. That's when I met Sivan first. And on that meeting, we had an explanation of the IT person that went over the whole backup process. And then Sivan just raised her hand and said, but wait, this is how we back up this HPLC, but what about the backup for all of the other systems? And moreover, what do we need to back up for all of the other systems? Did we define in such a methodic way, as we just did for the HPLC, what the source data is for the other systems and how is it maintained? And then she invited me to a journey that was exciting, and it was exciting to recall it once we prepared for this webinar. And I'm very happy to have you here, Sivan, and have you tell your story. So please, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Just a second, I will share my screen. Sorry, something went wrong. Okay. Do you see everything is okay?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, so I will start. So hello everyone, and thank you again, Roy, for having me here today. So a few words about myself. I'm a graduate of the Chemical Engineering Department at the Ben-Gurion University. I bring with me 17 years of experience in the industry, during which I had the opportunity to work in different roles. I started my way as a process engineer at the production facility for 2 years. Then I worked for 7 years in the engineering department of a pharmaceutical company. And for the past 8 years, I have been working in quality assurance, with 6 of those years at OPKO Biologics. So let me tell you a bit about OPKO. OPKO Biologics is one of OPKO Health functional groups. It is a biopharma R&D company. We're developing long-acting bio-better versions of therapeutic proteins and peptide drugs. Our facilities include the CMC development labs. We have upstream, downstream, chemistry, and QC lab that perform both analytical development and GMP batch release tests as needed. We have BioA unit that is GLP certified and do bioanalytical tests for the preclinical studies. Each lab use different kind of laboratory equipment and different kind of computerized systems. So when I joined OPKO, I already had experience working in GMP environment. I was familiar with the regulatory requirements related to data integrity and their core principles. I was familiar with the computerized system validation as well, but I was less familiar with the world of development, where the requirements are often less clear and there are no guidelines or strict do and don't rules. Still, it was clear that the data generated during development is critical for the company's success. Decision regarding the continuance of a product development is based on those results, which is why it was so important for us to ensure that the data is reliable. So as Roy mentioned, we started working together. First, we worked on mapping the data we collected from different instruments in the development laboratories. Together, we conducted a gap analysis and a risk assessment. And based on this risk assessment, We developed a mitigation plan and wrote detailed working instructions to ensure that the data we generate is reliable and remains reliable over the time. So the goal: source data must be kept in order to achieve and maintain high degree of data integrity and according to the ALCOA principles. Data can be retained either in the original system, subject to suitable controls, or in an appropriate archive. So what is an appropriate archive? The archive needs to ensure that the records, whether if electronic or printed, are available at all times. The information needs to retain reliable and without manipulations. The archive needs to ensure that there is not possible to add, delete, or modify source data without control and traceability. So now I would like to clarify something. The goal was not to perform a full validation or verification of all the source data generated during the development process. This would be a research and a time-consuming thing to do, and is not required for such early stages, especially when most of the work may not be relevant for the final process or for the regulatory submissions. So the goal was to ensure that all the data is saved in a way that will allow us to perform verification on a later stage if and when needed. We started the work with mapping the data collected from different kinds of instruments in the R&D labs. So we have the HPLC, which we mentioned before, the pH meters, nanodrop, densitometer, ELISA reader, balance, and so on. Different kinds of instruments. Some of the instruments used also in the GMP QC lab, and they were validated and compliant with the regulatory requirements for the computerized system that detailed in the CFR 21 Part 11. Other instruments do store electronic data, but do not meet regulatory requirements. And there are also simpler instruments that do not store any data, but sometimes they provide printouts. It's important to note that those instruments are used for development and proof of concept, while the regulatory requirements for the system validation typically applies only to advanced clinical phases. So there was not need for full computerized validation here. Okay, we started with the hard copy data. We reviewed the laboratory notebooks. Short computer printouts were attached to the notebook with glue. In some of the notebooks, we found printouts that were not pasted. Some of them did not contain details about the test or the date, and it was difficult to understand where they belong. So what we did? First, we tested different types of glues, and we chose a better kind. Then we reviewed the SOP. We find that there was an instruction that the printout needs to be signed and dated. So the team was retrained on documentation instructions, and good documentation practice was added to the annual refresher training plan. Additional controls that were taken is that the SOP was updated, and the team leaders were instructed to verify appropriate documentation when they sign as a second reviewer on the notebook. And we as a QA, we added the laboratory notebooks review to our internal audit checklist. We work with checklists for every audit. So today, short computer printouts can be attached to the notebook using appropriate glue. It needs to be signed and dated in a way that handwriting cross both printout and notebook page. Team leader and QA verifying appropriate documentation. Next thing was the long computer printouts. The long printouts were not attached to the notebook. There is a reference in the notebook to the location of the printout in a specific folder. We did a QC check. We checked some of the references in the notebooks and verified that we can track the source data and that the source printout is signed and dated. No observation were found, and also no kappa was taken here. Then we started working on the electronic data. First, the HPLC records. As Roy mentioned, the HPLC records are saved in a validated computerized system used also for the GMP work in the QC lab. So there was no kappa taken here either. Other electronic data. We find that all other electronic records saved in a file in OPKO folder. The access was unlimited and there was no audit trail, meaning any user can delete the file or manipulate the data. So what we did? We added user access control to the development binders. It is now limited to relevant team members only. We added automatic backup. Backup is available on a daily resolution over the past months, monthly resolution over the past year, and annual resolution for the last 7 years. The backup file saved in the backup server and in Amazon Cloud Server. We also created a new SOP for disaster recovery. This SOP includes periodic data recovery tests in order to verify that the data is saved over time. So today, electronic records are saved as a file in OPKO folder and in the backup servers. The data saved in the backup servers is protected and access is limited to IT only. But we still have a risk. Document can be changed prior to the daily backup or between the time interval of the periodic backups. So there might be cases that not all of the versions saved over time. It is also not allow us to track who changed the file and when. That is why OPKO critical data that might be submitted to the regulatory authorities can be saved as a control document under the GMP documentation system and under GMP SOPs. So this is it. This is how we work in OPKO. Thank you again, Roy.
Thank you, Sivan. Thank you very much. Maybe I see that we don't have any questions, but I prepared a few for myself. Maybe if you can stop the share, then we can just appear both of us.
Yes, just a second. How do I do that? Sorry, it's not that easy.
We're patient.
Okay.
Let me do this for you.
Found it.
Okay, very
It's
well.
okay?
Yes, great. So the first thing that came to my mind is that you mentioned, for example, for the GMP, that for the HPLC, sorry, that it has GMP capabilities, but it is also used for R&D. And my question is, why not apply the same controls that you use for GMP all across your R&D activities if you have systems that are capable of doing so?
Well, a short question to your answer is that that would be a crazy thing to do. The development environment is dynamic and always changing. Protocols and parameters change on a daily basis. And if we will require every method or protocol to be controlled with a change control, and a lot of people needed to edit, to review, and to approve, including QA, I can assure you that most probably the R&D personnel will be quit the job, okay? Development work is already complex, time-consuming, and very expensive. I think that our role as QA is to support the R&D with a minimize unnecessary task, and yet to ensure that the data is reliable and can be verified later on. So it's not an easy thing to do, but I think that having the right balance here is critical for the company's success.
And I think that it's very clear that actually for the more advanced stages and of course for products that are already on the market, that they might have to follow more, I would say, stricter guidelines, but that actually makes it easier for them because they know exactly what they need to do. And for these R&D stages, you need to decide for every new activity, how to refer to it, and everything is very dynamic and changes. And as you mentioned, your role is to make sure that you don't interfere, but you help ensure that all the data eventually can be used. And that leads me to the next question. You said that you keep your R&D records in a state in which they will be, they can be used in the future for verification.
Right.
When will you need to verify? When do you plan to verify R&D generated data?
Well, I guess once the process reaches more advanced stages and it's more clear which parts of the development work is necessary to support the final process, then we can start evaluating the data. Data that might be presented to the regulatory authorities will be verified. Well, let me think. Other reasons for verification might be business related, commercial collaboration with other companies or big investor that might request some data and we would like to verify the data before we give it to him. Or in cases that the company sale, that you need to verify the data you're moving forward.
Yeah, I think that this is very interesting. We covered it in on another webinar that we had over privacy and GDPR, where we mentioned that you need to follow these regulations or laws in the case of GDPR, not only for the regulators or the legislators, but also for investors and collaborations. They're going to look into your compliance. They're actually acquiring your data. They need to know that they're acquiring a good product that is verified. And can you, we covered mostly, or actually only today, in-house activities that you perform, but I assume that source data and source data verification comes up also once you work with the vendors, with outsourced suppliers. Is this something that you can share some experience about it, what it required from you? How do you approach that aspect of source data verification?
Well, that's a good question because we are, as I mentioned, we are R&D company. So the product manufacturing done by CMO. But we are still responsible for releasing the batch and issuing the CFA. We have a QC which is working under GMP. So all manufacturing related documentation included the batch records, the deviation, the in-process control, and some of the release tests that performed by the CMO needs to be sent here for final review and approval by QA. So we need to verify the data. In today's digital age, this process is quite straightforward. We use a secure server to share the documentation that we need for the verification. Most of the documents are electronic, but in some cases, the CMO is required to scan and upload the documents.
Understand. Is it something that you also mention or cover in the quality agreement, the source data? Mm-hmm.
Of course, it is covered in the quality agreement and in other working agreements between us and the CMO. And we know exactly, we have a table with exactly the protocols and reports and all kinds of records that need to be signed and approved by us. and with the timelines, of course.
And maybe if you can tell us a little bit about how you actually perform the verification. You mentioned that for GMP and GCP records, the verification is conducted routinely. But how do you perform it?
How do we perform GMP and GLP data
Verification.
verification? So according to our recipe, every measurement, weight, calculation, and analysis is subject to 100% quality control by a second reviewer. In addition to that, QA performs additional verification for some of the data to provide further insurance. Both the second reviewer and QA use approved and controlled checklist to perform the verification and to document their findings. We sign it. So this is how we work. Critical data, such as a batch release result, need the QC manager approval in addition to the second review and prior to the QA approval. So this is how we work, but you know, every company has its own SOPs.
Yes, but what I can understand from your answer that it is mainly risk-based, the way that you perform
Of
the
course, different
verification.
kind of documents, different kind of verification.
And I do see that we have some, I think it's not a question, but a comment. Let me just read it by Talal Al-Zahir. So thank you, Mr. Al-Zahir. I agree with Sivan. R&D is dynamic, R&D is dynamic and changes happen always. So teams need the full freedom of changes as they are trying to get the best results to discover. I think it should stay like this. I think that we both agree with that. Otherwise, you can simply say the company is unable to progress in its R&D efforts.
R&D development of a new product takes a lot of time, and it costs a lot of money. So we need to make it working somehow. So this is the way you choose your battles.
Yes, and it's a fine balance, as you mentioned before. Sivan, thank you very, very much. I think this has been very, very interesting to me, definitely. I see that our participants stayed for our discussion as well. So I hopefully because they found it interesting as well. And I really thank you for your time and for your efforts preparing for today and joining us. And I want to thank everyone for your participation in this series. Again, all of the previous webinars are available if you want to watch them. And we will send the presentations and the certificates in the coming, I hope, a few days, but please be patient with us. It might take us a bit longer. Sivan, thank you again.
Thank you, Ray. It was a pleasure to be here.
For me as well. Tanya, thank you as well. And thank you, everybody. Have a nice day.